Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. I'm Dr. Archana, a pediatric nephrologist from Rainbow Group of Hospitals, Hyderabad. Today, I would like to talk to you regarding childhood hypertension. So before we start presentation, if somebody asks me what is the best gift to any child, then my answer would be a healthy adulthood. So many problems of adults have their roots in children. So we being as primary pediatricians, if we can start the preventive aspects right from childhood, we would be gifting them all a healthy and a happy adulthood. Childhood hypertension is novel in many ways. First being it's underdiagnosed. When a study was conducted in the primary care setup in UK, they saw that only half of them had pediatric BP cuffs. Only half used instruments which were validated for pediatric use, and the confidence in interpreting the pediatric BP values was very low. Secondary hypertension in children is very common. Up to 50 to 60% of cases are secondary hypertension, unlike in adults where it amounts to only 10% of the cases. So many of the cases we need to do a detailed evaluation to look for secondary causes. And with increasing obesity, there is an upcoming epidemic of primary hypertension. Though this is more obvious in Western countries, in India in future this is going to happen too. Other important thing is hypertension tracks. So if you see this curve, you see that children who had elevated BP and when they grew up as adults, they became hypertensive, and children who were already hypertensive in their childhood itself, they became even more severe hypertensive. So the transition, this rate of transition is around 7% per year, and it depends strongly on body mass index. The problem when it starts in childhood, the damage also starts early on. So in this study, when they saw the histological features of blood vessels, there was a very good association between the histological features, the blood pressure values, and the lipid levels. Not only frank hypertensives, but also pre-hypertension can cause cardiac and vascular consequences. My aims of today's presentation would be to tell about the prevalence of hypertension, the history of clinical practice guidelines. Then we would be talking about the diagnosis, evaluation of hypertension, followed by management. We would be ending with the monitoring and the preventive aspects. The prevalence of clinical hypertension is around 3.5%. The prevalence of persistently elevated BP in children is around 2.2 to 3.5%. The first clinical practice guidelines came into being in 1977 with major revisions after that, with the last revision being in 2004. In 2017, the American Academy of Pediatrics has published the clinical practice guidelines, and my talk would be based on these guidelines basically. So for diagnosis of hypertension, what are most important things? Screening, measurement, interpretation, confirmation, and categorization. Indications of screening would be all children and adolescents who have completed 3 years of age should have an annual BP check done. Anybody having obesity, having renal disease, history of coarctation, or they're on certain medications like the following, they need to have their BP check done at every clinic visit. When children less than 3 years come to you with some specific conditions, they also need a BP check at every clinic visit, especially with history of prematurity, having congenital diseases, whether it's a heart disease or having congenital renal disease or CACUT with family history of congenital renal disease, having acquired renal diseases like recurrent UTIs, hematuria, proteinuria, children who have undergone transplant, children who have undergone using drugs which increase blood pressure, and children with certain systemic illnesses like neurofibromatosis, tuberous sclerosis, they also need to get the blood pressure check done even if they are less than 3 years old. All the guidelines which are based are basically on auscultatory devices. So except for neonates and infants, hypertension should always be confirmed by auscultation. There are many careful aspects which we should take when measuring BP. So especially it's generally in the right arm should be at the heart level. The most important thing is the cuff size, which should cover 80 to 100% of the arm circumference and the width around 40% of the arm circumference. For the accurate measurement, you can take a mid-arm circumference in the following manner. These are the various cuff sizes which are available. And these, in some brands, there are color codings also depending upon the cuff size. So when measuring BP, we have to take certain precautions. I would suggest you all to have a look at this video, which is given by the American Academy of Pediatrics, which clearly demonstrates what are the steps of taking a good auscultatory blood pressure. mercury less than the previous tables. And if you see, you can also see that the height in centimeters and inches is also mentioned in these tables, not only the centiles. So it makes things a lot easier. Just seeing the height, you can know. For example, a 4-year-old boy comes with a height of 105 centimeters, has a blood pressure of 104/60. How do we see it? So 4 years boy, he has a blood pressure, his height is around 105 centimeters, and the blood pressure is 104/60. So he's having blood pressure less than 90th centile. So he is not having elevated BP or hypertension. But for a quick screening in a busy outpatient clinic, there is this table where you can quickly screen whether the child has hypertension or not. This table gives values of 90th centile at 5th centile height. So it can just be used for screening. It cannot be used for confirmation. For neonates between 26 to 44 weeks of post-conceptional age, the table developed by Dion et al. Should be used. For infants, the curves published in the report of the second task force on blood pressure control are used. So you have taken the blood pressure, it's more than 90th centile, then we repeat the blood pressure measurement twice again. And then if the BP is 3 times more than 90th centile on auscultation, then we have to categorize the blood pressure. So normal is less than 90th centile. In children greater than 13 years, it's less than 120/80. Elevated is between 90th to 95th centile, or systolic blood pressure between 120 to 129. Stage 1 hypertension is more than 95th centile, but less than 12 mm mercury above it, or SBP between 130 to 139, and diastolic between 80 to 89. Stage 2 hypertension is 12 mm mercury more than the 95th centile or more than 140/90. Home BP monitoring is generally not recommended to diagnose hypertension, but then it's useful. Somebody has hypertension, you would like to know how well is the control at home, then already known hypertensives, you can monitor their adequacy of treatment by seeing their home BP records. Wrist and forearm monitors are not recommended in diagnosis or management of hypertension. Ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is something very important. So if you have, it consists of basically a BP cuff. It is attached to a box and it records BP periodically. It's basically suggested in children who have elevated BP for more than 1 year, or who have stage 1 hypertension over 3 clinic visits. It's also considered in children with certain high-risk conditions like secondary hypertension, CKD, diabetes, somebody who has undergone a transplant, somebody with obesity or obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, somebody with genetic syndromes. All these patients, they have a high risk of nocturnal and masked hypertension. So those are the cases where ABPM is very helpful. So it helps in diagnosis of white coat hypertension and masked hypertension. White coat hypertension is basically when your clinic BP is elevated, but then the ambulatory ABPM is normal. Masked hypertension is when the clinic BP is normal, but the ABPM is abnormal. So device should be validated, trained personnel should be used. Generally, we use the non-dominant arm unless there is a lot of blood pressure variation between the two limbs. Readings are generally taken every 15 to 20 minutes during the day and every 20 to 30 minutes at night. Adequate quality of ABPM should be there. Like there should be 1 reading per hour, 40 to 50 for the entire day. So this is how ABPM when it's being used looks like. The report is generally mentioned like mean BP, BP load and dipping. So if you see this, you have a mean 24 above BP, you have awake, both systolic and diastolic BP loads. So if you see that see here, the sleep systolic BP load is quite high, it's 83%. And it also mentions something called dipping. So dipping is basically at night time, due to the various neurohumoral mechanisms, the blood pressure is supposed to be 10 to 20% less than the daytime BP. If this doesn't happen, if the dipping is less than 10%, it's called a non-dipper, and sometimes there can be a rise in the night, which is called riser. So if you can see here, the systolic BP, there is non-dipping because it's less than 10%. When it comes to the diastolic BP, it's actually more, which means it is a riser status. So this is nocturnal hypertension. Evaluation, first when we go to history, maternal hypertension history is very important, because if we see these curves, the dotted lines, both the light one and the dark one, they indicate mothers who had gestational hypertension and preeclampsia. If you see, their children had higher BP values throughout their childhood. History of low birth weight is also important, and also important is children who crossed weight percentiles during early childhood, they demonstrate an increased risk of hypertension. That's what has been published in this paper in pediatrics. Complications occurring in NICU and requiring umbilical artery catheterization. We take an adequate nutritional history and physical activity history to know the risk factors for obesity, overweight. Family history, parents, grandparents, and first degree siblings. These are the people we should be more concerned about. And personal history, basically in adolescents, like smoking. So in examination, what are the most important things? We need a 3-limb BP to rule out aortic arch abnormalities and all. We need a good height and weight, because height and weight tell a lot of things. If somebody is stunted, it means that person has chronic disease, like it could be a CKD causing hypertension. Somebody who is having more, a weight which is more, means it's obesity causing primary hypertension. Neurocutaneous markers also point towards specific causes like neurofibromatosis and tuberous sclerosis. When it comes to abdomen, please look for tumor masses like Wilms tumor, neuroblastoma, or cystic kidneys. And when we hear for a flank bruit, then it's like we are almost sure it's a renal artery stenosis. Children who are greater than 6 years of age have positive family history, are overweight or obese with no obvious physical findings of a secondary cause. Generally, they're thought to have primary hypertension, and we generally do not advocate for an elaborate evaluation in them. Severity of BP cannot differentiate primary from secondary. Generally, primary hypertension cases have more of systolic hypertension, and diastolic hypertension is more in secondary cases. In secondary hypertension, renal causes are the most important causes. About 3/4 of them are due to renal. And when the age is less than 6 years, then the percentage goes even higher. Cardiac is basically due to coarctation. Long segment narrowing of abdominal aorta can cause hypertension. Endocrine causes constitute about 6%, but what is very nice with endocrine causes that you know the cause, you start treating with appropriate medication and surgical treatment, then the response can be very dramatic. Monogenic hypertension, the incidence is around 3%. So somebody having a suppressed plasma renin activity or an elevated aldosterone-renin ratio with the family history of early onset hypertension, yes, you should think of monogenic hypertension. Laboratory evaluation, all children who have hypertension should undergo a urine analysis, electrolytes, renal function, and a lipid profile. If their age is less than 6 years or there is some abnormality in the urine analysis or renal function, then we do a renal ultrasound. When somebody is obese, then you have to screen for other parameters of metabolic syndrome, for fatty liver, for diabetes, and for dyslipidemia. So based on the initial examination and the test results, if you feel that there is some possibility of renovascular disease, then there are several investigations possible. Ultrasound Doppler, the sensitivity maximum is up to 90%, and the results are best in children more than 8 years who are cooperative, who are non-obese. So generally it is suggested only in those settings. Otherwise, CT angio and MR angio have comparable sensitivity and specificity, and they can be used. But neither is a substitute for the gold standard, which is angiography. Nuclear renography, like captopril renogram, it's not recommended as a screening test for renal artery stenosis in children. So if you doubt for a thyroid hormone abnormality, then you do a thyroid screen. If you want to diagnose obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, then we do a sleep study. When we want to evaluate for target organ damage, ECG is generally not recommended in hypertensive children because according to this study, it was seen that the positive predictive value of ECG is very low. So echo should be done because left ventricular mass index highly correlates with the blood pressure control, and left ventricular hypertrophy is known to cause adverse cardiovascular outcomes in adults at least. So left ventricular target injury is basically defined on the basis of left ventricular mass index, relative wall thickness, and an ejection fraction. Indications for a 2D echo would be prior to starting treatment, everybody you need to get a 2D echo done. And thereafter, if it's normal, yearly you should be repeating in children with stage 2 hypertension, secondary hypertension, or incompletely treated stage 1 hypertension. Repeat echo should be done 6 to 12 monthly for somebody whose baseline is abnormal. Other causes of target organ damage, uric acid. So there are studies like this which show that the childhood uric acid is high in hypertensive children and also in adults. And also studies which show that reduction of uric acid using allopurinol, it rectifies pre-hypertension as well as it helps in lowering blood pressure in frank hypertensive cases. But these are all very small size clinical trials, and we need further studies to bring this into practice. Microalbuminuria is another thing. It's been shown that lowering microalbuminuria causes regression of left ventricular hypertrophy. But microalbuminuria is itself a non-specific thing. It's elevated in obese children, in diabetes. After exertion also it can get elevated. So it's still not clear whether this should become a routine practice. And routine monitoring of the vascular structure and function is also not recommended yet. So after we measure the BP and all, how do we treat them? How do we manage them? Having elevated BP, then we have to follow them up 6 monthly for a year. And if they continue to remain having elevated BP, they require further evaluation. For stage 1 hypertension, if they persist more than 3 months, then they require a subspecialty referral with ABPM and treatment initiation. For stage 2 hypertension, it should be much quicker. Within the next 1 week, we need to have an ABPM subspecialty referral and initiate treatment. But irrespective of whatever is the stage of hypertension, lifestyle counseling and should be done at first contact itself. If somebody's BP reading is at stage 2 and the patient is symptomatic, or BP reading is more than 30 mm mercury above the 95th centile or greater than 180 by 120, he or she should be referred to the emergency department immediately. The treatment goals would be a diastolic and a systolic blood pressure less than 90th centile. Previously, this was around 95th centile. The reason it was lowered was when they saw in this study, the left ventricular mass index was increased in hypertensive as well as pre-hypertensive children. So to obviate the effects of target organ damage, the target centiles have been reduced to 90th centile. Treatment strategies include lifestyle and pharmacological treatment. So diet is very important, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. This is the DASH score table. So it's basically low salt, less of saturated fats, less of sugary beverages, more of fruits and vegetables, which will improve the blood pressure, along with physical activity and stress reduction. Pharmacological treatment is given to somebody who is hypertensive despite lifestyle modification, to somebody with symptomatic hypertension, stage 2 hypertension, and any hypertension with CKD or diabetes. So we have to use the stepped-up care approach where we start with a single medication, increase the dose of medication till we get adverse effects or till maximum dose is achieved. Still, if the BP is not controlled, we go to the second medicine. ACE inhibitors, ARBs, calcium channel blockers are generally the first line. ACE and ARBs are the drugs of choice in CKD, proteinuria, and diabetes. Thiazide generally becomes a second agent because of salt and water retention. Alpha beta blockers and direct vasodilators, centrally acting agents, are generally used after 2 drugs. In some special situations like acute severe hypertension where there is a risk of target organ damage like encephalopathy, AK, and heart failure, blood pressure lowering should be done in over 24 to 48 hours. And for such cases, the short-term BP goal would be around 95th centile. CKD and hypertension is like a vicious cycle. CKD causes hypertension and hypertension worsens GFR. So when they did in the ESCAPE trial, they have seen that lowering the blood pressure to 58th centile, it helped a lot because then only quarter of them had worsening GFR over 5 years. Whereas if the target was placed at 90th centile, almost half of them had worsening GFR or went to end stage. So strict blood pressure control is very important in CKD. 6% of type 1 diabetes and 12% of type 2 diabetes can have hypertension. So all diabetic patients, every health visit need a BP check and pharmacological therapy to be started along with lifestyle modification. Dyslipidemia and hypertension often occur together because it's obesity, overweight, which causes both. So both should be dealt together. Obstructive sleep apnea is very notorious for causing nocturnal hypertension. So ABPM is a preferred modality to diagnose it. It's not still clear whether CPAP and adenotonsillectomy can improve the blood pressure completely. You can participate in sports and increase physical activity is okay, but competitive sports should be restricted until BP is normalized, especially in cases where there is left ventricular hypertrophy or stage 2 hypertension. Post-transplant, the incidence of hypertension is very high, up to 50 to 90%, and majority of them, they can have masked and nocturnal hypertension. So ABPM is very important in them. The prevalence of hypertension doesn't depend on what transplant the patient has undergone. And what is more important is in renal transplant, the graft survival is better. If you see this, the graft survival at 15 and 20 years was 68% and 53% for recipients without hypertension and 53 and 33% for recipients with hypertension. So transplant outcomes improve with better BP control. Resistant hypertension is defined when it's unresponsive to 3 or more antihypertensive agents. Doses are generally maximal with 1 diuretic. So we need to confirm resistant hypertension with an ABPM. It's generally treated on lines of adult hypertension because we actually don't know whether it truly exists in pediatric cases. Dietary sodium restriction, elimination of substances which are known to elevate BP, re-evaluating for secondary causes of hypertension, and optimization of the current therapy should be done. So once you start the treatment, if the blood pressure is not controlled, then we have to keep monitoring once in 4 to 6 weeks. The target BP is not achieved. When the treatment goal is achieved, then we have to monitor once every 3 to 4 months. If only lifestyle changes are being advocated, then we can follow them up 3 to 6 monthly. Home BP measurement, especially during follow-up, is a better tool of assessment because we can go through the home BP records and see the adequacy of treatment. At each visit, we need to ask for adherence to therapy and adherence to the lifestyle modification. And we also need to screen for any adverse effects of medication and also screen for target organ damage. So preventive aspects, good diet, good sleep hygiene, avoidance of tobacco products. And whenever there is family history of hypertension, then we need closer BP monitoring. So my take home message would be blood pressure screening should start from early childhood as hypertension tracks. ABPM is a valuable tool for diagnosis of nocturnal hypertension, masked hypertension, and white coat hypertension. Age more than 6 years, positive family history, and obesity suggest primary hypertension. Renal structural and renal vascular causes contribute almost 3/4 of secondary hypertension. Echocardiography should be done at diagnosis and also periodically thereafter assess for target organ damage. Stepped care approach is employed for titrating medication, and lifestyle modification is as important as pharmacotherapy. With this, I would like to end the session on a lighter note. Thank you for your kind attention. I would be happy to take any questions.
Good evening. Today's topic of discussion is refractive urinary tract infections in children and clinical approach and management. So what are refractive infections? They're basically recurrent UTIs that are very difficult to treat. It's when children present with 2 or more urinary tract infections with acute pyelonephritis or upper urinary tract infections, 1 episode of urinary tract infection, the upper tract, plus 1 lower urinary tract infection such as cystitis, or 3 episodes of cystitis in a child. They usually present with recurring fever, dysuria, maybe lower abdominal pain, pain while passing or crying while voiding. There are repeated growths in repeat urine cultures that may never disappear. And the child has been on multiple courses of antibiotics without any relief. So how should we approach such a child who's very difficult to treat? Antenatal history should be taken. Any history of antenatal hydronephrosis is of utmost importance. Some parents usually neglect, or they might have had an ultrasound, or they've been told that this hydronephrosis will disappear and they don't have to worry about it. But it is of significance, especially if a child has had refractory urinary tract infection. The presentation of symptoms is very important because that can tell us the origin of the source of infection. Is it associated with febrile urinary tract infections or just lower urinary tract symptoms? The child has to be evaluated for bowel bladder dysfunction, especially if they are recurrent. One of the simple ways of evaluating is using the dysfunctional voiding scoring system, using a Bristol stool chart also to evaluate for bladder bowel dysfunction. This is the dysfunctional voiding scoring system. It's a very simple scoring system. It takes a few minutes for the parent and the child to fill. It is scored between 0, 1, 2, and 3. In girls, a score of 6 or above is considered as voiding dysfunction. In a boy, a score of 9 and above is considered as voiding dysfunction. Questions are asked such as, do they have daytime wetting, such as wet clothes or underwear? Do they, pass stools every day? Do they have to, force to pass stools? Do they have to strain to defecate? Do they void frequently or infrequently? Do they avoid voiding by doing the pee dance or by squatting or crossing the legs? Or do they have any history of urgency? Do they have to strain to void? Does it hurt for the child to void? All these are very important questions, and the DVSS scoring system has simplified it and allows you to score and use this to screen the child whether they have any bowel bladder dysfunction. The International Children's Continence Society has a very large or very extensive parental questionnaire. It is much more detailed. Not only does it ask very specific questions about daytime voiding, nighttime wetting, about behavioral changes. It asks about food and dietary habits. It asks about bowel habits. It's a 5-page questionnaire that has to be filled with yes or no. This gives us a good idea about how does the child void. It's very important to ask this question about daytime and nighttime wetting in a toilet-trained child. a child who's never wet the bed previously but has recently started, a child who has learned how to control the urine but has recently started wetting the pants. These are very important questions to ask in the clinic. The other important thing is to evaluate for constipation. So using the Paris Consensus terminology tool, constipation is defined as bowel movements less than 3 times per week, or fecal incontinence more than once per week, large obstructive stools that obstruct the toilet, stool withholding behavior, that is when the child prefers to stand to defecate, the child does not have a regular time to defecate. These are all known as stool withholding behavior, severe abdominal pain while defecating, or palpable stools per abdomen. We do see these kind of symptoms quite often in the child. The very familiar Bristol stool chart can be given to the parents to try to see what kind of constipation the child has. So a very definitive history is important in evaluating a child with refractory infections. The other important thing is to definitely examine the child thoroughly. In girls, looking for labial adhesions is important. The reason it is important is because if there are adhesions, there can be pooling of urine into the vagina, and that could be a source for recurrent infections. If there are no labial adhesions, at least look for vulvitis. There might be reddening around the area. That is also a clue that the child is having a source of recurrent infections. Phimosis in a boy is very important. To look for any neurological signs and symptoms by looking at the anus, a patchless anus, examining the spine. Clinical examination of the abdomen should be, to see if there are any fecal masses that are palpable, to see if there's any hydronephrosis, palpable renal masses, or a palpable bladder that is persistently distended, in spite of examining after the child has voided. These are very important clues in telling us whether we're dealing with a child with a bowel bladder dysfunction also associated with urinary tract infections. So how do we investigate these children? First is children with febrile urinary tract infections should get a screening ultrasound. This is very important in looking for any structural defects, such as we have to look for the renal parenchymal thickness, hydronephrosis or thinning of parenchyma of less than 10 mm, dilated pelvis more than 10 mm, ureter diameter more than 3 to 5 mm, and looking at the bladder thickness of more than 4 mm, and also looking at the post-void residue in the child, which I haven't mentioned in the slide. Post-void residue of more than 20 ml is also considered significant in a child. That shows that the child is not emptying the bladder to completion. And this is again a very important cause of recurrent urinary tract infections. When do we do a micturating cystourethrogram, otherwise known as a VCUG? Especially if a child has had antenatal bilateral hydronephrosis, recurrent urinary tract infections, hydronephrosis or hydroureter on an ultrasound in a child with UTI, a persistent thickened bladder in spite of resolution of lower urinary tract symptoms. These conditions warrant a micturating cystourethrogram. What are we looking for in an MCUG? If you look at the first child image, is a recent child who presented to us with recent onset of bedwetting, was an 8-year-old boy with history of bedwetting of 3 months duration since the lockdown started, and also daytime wetting, which he did not notice earlier, and a poor stream of urine. We evaluated this child. We first started with behavioral modification, and then since the hydronephrosis and he screening ultrasound, which showed mild hydronephrosis, and because of which we got a micturating cystourethrogram. The micturating cystourethrogram shows a very large dilated irregular bladder with reflux on one side and a dilated posterior urethra. We had done a cystoscopy for this child on Monday, and this child had posterior urethral valves, which presented quite late at the age of 8. So another indication to thoroughly, systematically evaluate these children. The image below is a child with neurogenic bladder. As you can see, it's a very irregular shaped bladder, oblong, distended or pushed off to one side with bilateral reflux. So again, evaluating the spine or any history of neurogenic, neurological deficit is very, very important. It's also important to look at the feet of the child to see if there's any rocker bottom feet, see if there are any persistent ulcerations, look at the size of the calf muscles on both sides, look at the, the gluteal raphe, see if it is deviated, any stigmata of a spina bifida occulta, looking at for sacral dimple, examining the spine all the way down to the coccyx. These are very important examinations to evaluate for neurogenic, causes of recurrent UTIs. Doing a per-rectal examination and looking at the sphincter tightness is also a part and parcel of the examination. The image above here is a child with recurrent urinary tract infections. As you can see, this child has had gross reflux on the left side with a poorly functioning kidney, and grade 3 reflux on the other side, or grade 4 with a dilated ureter. And the child here in the lower image shows that there is reflux that is happening all the way down into the epididymis. So this child had recurrent urinary tract infections along with recurrent epididymoorchitis. So children can present in a myriad of ways, and it is very important that we examine them thoroughly to see what is the root cause of these infections. A nuclear scan is very important in, again, guiding us further treatment. Now, usually most urinary tract infections are evaluated with two approaches, the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach. The top-down approach usually involves getting an ultrasound first. If the ultrasound is abnormal, then getting a DMSA scan. This is dimercaptosuccinic acid. This is used to evaluate the renal morphology and structure, that is to look for renal scarring. And if the DMSA shows any evidence of renal scarring, then the child undergoes a MCUG. As you can see in this image, the child has bilateral polar scars, suggestive that this child may have had vesicoureteric reflux. But it is not necessary that a child who has reflux will have an abnormal DMSA, or that a child who has an abnormal DMSA may have reflux. Some reflux may not be picked up on a MCUG, but the scars are a warning sign, and we have to be monitoring these children along with our nephrologist. The second scan here is a DTPA scan. In this child, we have hydronephrosis on the right side. As you can see that the drainage is quite delayed. And because of this holding up of urine into the renal pelvis, this is again a cause of recurrent urinary tract infections. And if a child with hydronephrosis presents with urinary tract infections and is suggestive of pelviureteric junction obstruction, these children need early pyeloplasty, and we cannot wait on surgery for them. So again, it's very important to evaluate and deal with the root cause. Some children do not have any evidence of pelviureteric junction obstruction. They may not have primary vesicoureteric reflux. They may have thickened bladders, or they'll complain of passing with a poor stream. These children further need to be evaluated with something called a urodynamic study. A urodynamic study involves putting catheters into the bladder and the rectum. We measure the pressures between the, within the bladder using this urodynamic study, equipment. And we're able to see the different pressures in the bladder. And very high pressures in the bladder, that means the bladder is stiff, it is not distending, or even if it's holding urine, it's holding under high pressure. This pressure, even with or without reflux, can reflect onto the kidneys and cause ongoing renal damage and push these children into chronic renal disease and onto renal failure. So as you can see in the first graph, you can see that the pressure has risen very rapidly. And this is very, very dangerous, because this shows that this child is having almost impending bladder failure. And this means that the kidneys are at risk. The second graph, you can see it's a very irregular graph that shows that the detrusor contracts throughout the filling of the bladder. And when this happens, this probably pushes out urine in between, and the child is probably leaking small quantities of urine with each contraction of the detrusor. So it's very important information in planning the management. If you're doing video urodynamics, we have a pump here, we have a catheter in the urinary system, we have a catheter in the rectum. These are the pressure sensors. And we get a graph which shows the vesicle pressure, which is from the bladder catheter. We get the abdominal pressure from the rectal catheter. We subtract these and we get the pressure within the bladder, which is the bladder vesicle pressure or the detrusor pressure. And we allow the child to void urine into a flow meter, so we can look at the flow of the urine, which is again tells us if there are any urethral obstructions in these children. So it's again very important to know the pressures in the bladder in refractory children. EMR urogram is done very judiciously in children. These are usually done if conventional imaging, such as an ultrasound, micturating cystourethrogram, do not provide us with sufficient information. Usually done with children with abnormal upper tract anomalies, such as a duplex kidney, maybe a duplication, cross-fused ectopia. It involves intravenous hydration, furosemide injection, and gadolinium-based contrast material injection. This gives a good imaging of the upper urinary tracts and the lower urinary tracts. It's very well indicated in evaluating ectopic ureters in a girl child. It cannot diagnose reflux, but it can give imaging suggestive of reflux, as in this child. You can see in this image, the kidney is irregularly shaped with probable scarring that's happened at the sides of the reflux. So these are, again, it's a part and parcel of your armamentarium, but this is not your primary diagnostic tool. Another very important part of your diagnostic evaluation is a cystoscopy. Cystoscopy is usually done under a daycare admission in our hospital. It's done under general anesthesia. It is very important to evaluate the urethra and the bladder, sometimes in children after surgery also, and to give us a good look at what level, what are we looking at inside. We look at whether the bladder is trabeculated or not. We look whether the ureteric orifices are easily visible. Are they dilated or not? Are they positioned in the correct place? Are they opening within the, the trigone? Are they opening in the bladder neck, urethra, or elsewhere? Is the urethra normal? If it's a boy child, is the posterior urethra dilated? Is there any presence of valves, such as in this image over here? And is the rest of the anterior urethra normal or not? In a girl child, if you're suspecting ectopic ureters, it's also important to put the scope into the vagina and to see if there's any orifice or urine leaking within the vagina also. So how do we treat these children? It's very vexing to treat these children because your answers are limited in these children, and parents are not forthcoming with the history or symptoms. So you have to ask very leading questions, like I said, using those questionnaires, such as the dysfunctional voiding questionnaire and the ICCS questionnaire for a more elaborate evaluation. Repeated urine cultures are important, preferably a suprapubic sample if you're suspecting colonizers. Make sure that the dosage of antibiotics is adequate and the duration of antibiotic usage is for a minimum of 7 to 10 days. Especially if you're treating a child with a refractory urinary tract infection, I would suggest to repeat a urine culture on day 7 of antibiotics before stopping the antibiotics on day 10. If there is growth of bacteria, maybe to continue antibiotics for a further 10 days period. Important to evaluate and treat bowel bladder dysfunction. Simple things have to be told to parents because a lot of parents and children need monitoring. They need to monitor the fluid intake for a child. We recommend at least 1.5 liters in a child. They have to void regularly. Children, especially those who have holding behaviors, especially during the school year, we see a lot of children do not like to visit the bathrooms in the school, so they tend to hold on to the urine, and this eventually causes a lot of bladder dysfunction. So we have to educate the child has to void every 2 to 3 hours, and they have to empty their bladder with completion. Another important thing that the parents should do are to make dietary changes. A lot of children, as you see, have very poor intake of dietary fiber or a generally well-balanced, healthy diet. Laxatives are a very important part of your armamentarium in treating, refractory urinary tract infections. Children who are constipated, a couple of things happen. One is the hard stool occupies a space in the pelvis, so again causing bladder dysfunction. There's a stool within the rectum constantly, which allows a lot of colonization of the perineal area and allows recurrent seeding and infections, especially in a girl child. So again, giving laxatives for a long duration is important. Short duration laxatives do not really make much difference to the child. So what I usually recommend is I give laxatives for a period of minimum 3 to 6 months. I ask the parents to make all the dietary and voiding changes and the volitional voiding changes. I encourage the child to pass stools in the morning after they wake up. So once a child is able to make all these behavioral changes, then we continue the laxatives for another month or two until we can confirm this. And then we slowly withdraw the laxatives over a period of 1 to 2 months. So again, laxatives should not be withdrawn suddenly, and they have to be given for an adequate duration to make a difference to the child. So another important part of treating bowel bladder dysfunction is timed voiding. Now, what is timed voiding? Timed voiding is to encourage the child to void every 2 to 3 hours and to encourage the child to empty the bladder while they're in the bathroom. If you see most children, especially when they're occupied with screens, school, or playing with games or toys, they run to the bathroom till the last moment and they almost wet their pants while removing the pants. And then they pass a little bit of urine. Once the sensation of voiding goes away, then they run back to their game. And another 10 minutes later, they're running back to the bathroom again. This is a very common complaint I see in parents who bring their children, especially after the summer holidays. And especially during this lockdown period, I have seen at least a dozen children who the parents have come with history of urgency and frequency, all symptoms that have started since the holidays had started. So again, it's very important to, tell the parents that they should encourage the child to void regularly. And when the child visits the bathroom, the child has to void what's there in the bladder. They have to count to 10 2 times and empty the bladder till the last drop comes. Very important to mention all of these things. And if some children with a lot of urgency and frequency with a thickened bladder, if a urodynamic study which shows detrusor overactivity, anticholinergics are very important. Anticholinergics like oxybutynin that we use commonly in children usually act on the muscarinic receptors on the detrusor muscle. These help relax the detrusor muscle. That means a very overactive, a detrusor that keeps on sending a signal that the child has to void is another cause for either daytime wetting or increasing the frequency of voiding in a child and the urgency symptoms that they feel. So by relaxing the detrusor, the child can hold on to urine for a longer time, and they don't get this frequent signal from the detrusor that they need to visit the loo again and again. Another important part of armamentarium, that is when you scale up the treatment in some children whom symptoms don't improve in spite of treating, voiding, timed voiding, or anticholinergics, is clean intermittent catheterization. Especially children with those abnormal bladders that we saw in the MCUG, they would benefit by doing CIC. Now, CIC children, there's a bad rumor that CIC children are not usually compliant, families run away. But it involves very patient education. It is important to include the child and the mother in part of the learning process. It involves introducing a very fine, thin catheter through the urethra in a child, very cleanly, using only soap and water for your hands to wash. No need to use any gloves or any such thing, to empty the bladder and then remove the catheter. In the night, we keep the catheter and we leave it in by connecting it to a urobag. What this does is this reduces the pressures in the bladder. It reduces the pressures that are transmitted to the kidney and helps improve the hydronephrosis and on the pressures on the kidney. This can also improve the bladder dynamics by allowing the bladder to the detrusor activity or the hypertrophy of the detrusor to slowly modify itself. So again, CIC is the baseline of treatment in very difficult voiding dysfunction children, those especially who have bladder changes or who have urodynamic changes such as detrusor overactivity, high pressure bladders, or non-compliant bladders. So very important that we encourage parents to start CIC and keep monitoring them and support them while they're doing CIC. So some children do need surgery. Something as basic as releasing labial adhesions can improve treating a refractive UTI. Circumcision in those children who have very severe phimosis. Children with vesico-ureteric reflux, whom it's not resolving naturally, especially those with high-grade reflux, such as grade 4, grade 5. They may benefit either from an endoscopic injection, to tide them over, or a ureteric reimplantation, especially if they have renal scars. It's also very important to repair any other anatomical anomaly that the child may have. So if a child has pelviureteric junction obstruction, to repair the PUJ obstruction by doing a pyeloplasty. If the child has any other abnormality such as an ectopic ureter, a reflux into the vas, all these have to be corrected. And unless these are corrected, the chances of urinary tract infections are not going to improve. If a child has a post-urethral valve, that has to be fulgurated, valve bladder management has to be done. And all of these involve a holistic approach for treating this child. So follow-up involves long-term monitoring of the bladder, the kidney. So we ask for routine ultrasound every 3 months for the first year, every 3 months, and then every 6 months, the second year onwards, if they don't have further infections, especially if they have any underlying conditions such as voiding dysfunction, an abnormal bladder, or hydroureteronephrosis. We educate the children, parents, how to identify infections, how to give a urine sample early, and to make sure that they're monitored for their bowel bladder dysfunction. And all this treatment is done in conjunction with our pediatric nephrologist, because at the end of the day, our long-term goal is to prevent renal disease and long-term chronic renal disease in these children. Thank you.
Okay, so here are the questions. I'm Dr. Archana. Here are the questions for the first session. So Dr. Rashmi has asked that an 8-year-old obese with family history comes with hypertension. What should we consider first? So this looks like a primary hypertension because more than 6 years of age with positive family history. So we do the basic initial test which we should do in all children with hypertension. We start lifestyle modification, and depending upon the stage of hypertension, depending on the stage of hypertension, suppose only stage 1 hypertension, then we can wait for 3 months. If it's only elevated BP, we can wait for 1 year. But if it's stage 2 hypertension, even it's primary, then the child would need things going on quickly. Like within the next 1 week, you will have to reassess the child, and then reassess the child, do a ABPM if possible, or refer to a subspecialist to start treatment. And if the child is symptomatic, even if it's primary hypertension, then we should consider it as acute severe hypertension and treat accordingly. So Dr. Anil Kiran has asked how to taper antihypertensives in a case of post-infectious GN. Okay, so basically in post-infectious GN, generally the hypertension is due to fluid retention, water and salt retention. So generally in all cases of PIGN, the first line of treatment would be a diuretic. So even in spite of the diuretic and inadequate diuresis, if the child is hypertensive, it itself points towards an atypical glomerulonephritis. So we can start other antihypertensives like calcium channel blockers, but in no way we can never start ACE or ARBs, because GN can have AKI, and ACE and ARBs are contraindicated in AKI. So what we do is we give diuretics, we start another antihypertensive, blood pressure is not controlled. And generally once the child is dry, the child should no longer require antihypertensives. So the maximum duration of antihypertensives requirement should be 2 weeks in any case of post-infectious GN. If it is more than that, then actually it becomes an atypical thing, and actually the child would require a biopsy to know what is the reason for the GN. Might be it's not a PIGN at all. There is another question here after Dr. Anil's. So do we have to repeat urine culture after treatment, has been asked by Dr. Lakshman Kumar. Sir, if you are referring to a UTI, I do not think we need to repeat a urine culture. If it's generally, sometimes what happens is children who have very bad CACUT and all, they with repeated antibiotic use, they can have fungal UTIs. In fungal UTIs, I do recommend that we repeat a urine culture after treatment, but otherwise for a bacterial UTI, if the complete urine examination is normal, if there is symptomatic improvement, then I guess we need not do it.
Hello, Dr. Lavanya, and I'm answering some of the questions that were asked in the session. One is to repeat urine culture after treatment, not for routine infections where you think that the child has resolved symptomatically, but in those children with recurrent urinary tract infections, I would suggest to repeat the urine culture while the child is on antibiotics before stopping the antibiotic. Yeah. And how sensitive is ultrasound in detecting cystitis? Actually, quite good. Especially if you have a good radiologist whom you have a good communication with. They can pick up the thickness or the irregularity of the mucosa. They can pick up debris in the bladder. So these are very important. Urine microscopy. Yeah, if urine microscopy is normal, that could involve that maybe either the sample was improperly read. That is one thing. Either if the parents have given the sample or the lab has read the sample way after the sample has been given. In that way, urine microscopy could be normal. Maybe the child is having only cystitis changes, but maybe the child has already had a dose of antibiotics, so the urine microscopy could be normal. Nowadays, as you can see, that our parents are very proactive in giving antibiotics even before they visit us. So getting a urine culture, that to a proper, either catheter sample or a suprapubic sample, especially in a recurrent UTI, is of utmost importance. Another question is, sometimes do we need to do MCU after UTI? Many times, although a child is asymptomatic, repeatedly the culture is positive. So when do we need to treat these children before MCU? So especially if you have a culture positive, when the child is asymptomatic, that is without fever, without crying while voiding, or has good weight gain in a small baby, it is very important that you repeat your urine culture with a suprapubic tap, and then see if there's any bacteria there. And if there's still infection in a suprapubic tap, then you need to treat it. Now, when do we do an MCUG? You do a screening ultrasound. If your screening ultrasound shows it's a normal study, maybe we can wait on to the MCUG. If a child has recurrent multiple infections where the ultrasound is normal, the DMSA, you could do a DMSA. If the DMSA is abnormal, then an MCUG is indicated. Or you're not quite sure, then no harm in getting an MCUG. But it's not the primary investigation that we do. We do definitely a screening ultrasound, and we look for any structural anomalies before we recommend an MCUG. When to start nitrofurantoin or methotrexate? Not methotrexate. Sorry, Septran. Those are very good prophylactic antibiotics. Sometimes you have very resistant organisms and only nitrofurantoin is sensitive. But the problem with nitrofurantoin is children do not tolerate it very well. So if the child does not have any fever but has only a culture positive UTI with dysuria symptoms, then nitrofurantoin is an excellent antibiotic to start. Getting Bactrim or Septran is extremely difficult, being a very low cost antibiotic. Most pharmacies do not stock it, but that would be my ideal drug for starting for prophylaxis in a child in case I want to start prophylaxis. The use of low dose antibiotics in recurrent UTI, yeah, I think it's really important, especially if you have scarring in the DMSA, but you do not have reflux and MCUG, and the child has multiple episodes of infection. No harm in giving a short course of prophylactic low-dose antibiotics at night and to monitor the child. And if the child does not have any infections for a period of 3 to 6 months, maybe you can educate the parents on, identifying the symptoms of urinary tract infections, giving an early sample for urine examination and culture, and treating the infection instead of prophylaxis. What is the drug of choice in bedwetting? The drug of choice, if you want to go directly to medical management, which is not recommended, is usually, you have sublingual desmopressin. But before I, ever give any medication for bedwetting, I need to evaluate the child. It is very important, and most of your children will have daytime symptoms. So you cannot treat bedwetting in isolation without evaluating for daytime symptoms, looking for frequency, urgency, wetting of pants, bowel bladder dysfunction, and making sure that you have changed the behavior change for the food, the dietary changes, the timed voiding, and then only you drug the child. You treat the child with bedwetting with drugs. We do not primarily treat bedwetting with drugs. It's a very poor choice. And if you're going to treat any bedwetting with medication such as desmopressin, you have to make sure that the child is water compliant. That means that the child stops drinking water 2 hours before bedtime. Otherwise, they can have dilutional hyponatremia. So it's a very, very important thing to remember. Do not treat bedwetting with drugs primarily. It's important to evaluate. Now, two very strong questions: when to start prophylactic antibiotics? Prophylactic antibiotics are what we use in vesica-ureteric reflux when the child has persistent persistent urinary tract infections. Nowadays, the view is not using prophylactic antibiotics for grade 1, 2, or 3 VUR, that is non-dilating reflux, because these refluxes do resolve as the child grows up. It is very important to educate the parents for treating, to identify urinary tract infections, to teach some good local hygiene about management of bowel and bladder, that is to defecate in the morning, to void recurrent, properly volitional voiding on time, and to make sure that the child empties the bladder. If the parents can understand these instructions, we do not have to start prophylactic antibiotics for low-grade reflux. We definitely give prophylactic antibiotics for high-grade reflux, such as grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5, or in children who have recurrent scarring, which is increasing. And also, we usually give prophylactic antibiotics in children after urological reconstructive surgery, such as either they've undergone a pyeloplasty or a ureteric reimplant. And this is usually for a short duration of 3 months. And if we give prophylactic antibiotics, we would give it for at least minimum 2 years, and we would reevaluate the child and see whether there's any further necessity to see if the reflux is resolving or not. If they have recurrent breakthrough infections while on prophylactic antibiotics, it's very important to reevaluate the child, see the cause of breakthrough. If it is a grade 4 or grade 5 reflux, then early surgery is recommended. We can even do reimplantation surgeries in a child of less than 1 year if they have breakthrough infections with DMSA scarring. There's a question asking role of imipramine in bedwetting. Not as a primary drug. It's when you use your entire armamentarium. It starts with behavior modification, regulating the water intake, make sure that they drink and eat regularly during the daytime, making sure that you're monitoring their daytime symptoms. And then you can give imipramine. But again, the drug of choice is usually desmopressin if you're going to treat bedwetting with medication. What is the role of urinary alkalizer in pediatric UTI and the role of cranberry juice in UTI? Again, I don't really use this in my practice. Cranberry juice, there's a lot of studies that have been done. They do say that cranberry juice really works for E. coli infections. I've not really read too much about it. Alkalizer, all of us inevitably give Citralka because it at least relieves dysuria symptoms, but I don't really see a big role in alkalizer for pediatric UTIs. Should there be cycling of prophylactic antibiotics to avoid resistance? Again, we are trying to get off the cycle of using prophylactic antibiotics unnecessarily. So no, I don't really cycle my prophylactic antibiotics unless I see my child having recurrent breakthrough infections. So that's again important. And if you're having breakthrough infections, again, you have to evaluate the child completely to see what's happening. And if they're having breakthrough infections, it is important to, if they have a structural defect, is to correct the underlying defect. Resistance, again, the very important thing is that we use urinary specific antibiotics such as nitrofurantoin, or you can use, sulfur drugs such as streptan, and I think these are very important, to use drugs that are not commonly used in treating urinary tract infections. So no, I don't really cycle prophylactic antibiotics. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, some of the questions which are left behind from the previous talk. So we have Dr. Lakshman Kumar, who has asked about minimum age of renal transplant. So the minimum age is generally, there's no minimum age, actually it's more of a minimum weight. So the best of the surgeons, I think, are comfortable with the weight of around 10 kgs at least, 10 to 12 kgs. So at least 2 to 3 years, that was the minimum age as of I know for renal transplant. So the next question is, so Dr. Jayapriya has asked that they had a patient who came with vomiting, headache and convulsion, and BP was more than 99 centi. The urine analysis, ultrasound abdomen with Doppler CT angio of abdomen was normal. Urinary metanephrines was normal. Urinary cortisol is normal. So I think it's a very difficult case. So Dr. Jayapriya, I would suggest we also need to, I hope the renal function was normal. I think we need to screen for endocrine causes, and yes, we need to screen for endocrine causes like thyroid and all, and we also need to screen for monogenic hypertension. So for monogenic hypertension, we need to do a plasma renin activity and an aldosterone renin ratio. So that would actually complete the workup. And if we don't get anything, I think we need to repeat the investigations again to see if there are any new things which are evolving in the, if previously the investigations are normal and now new things are evolving. And I think echo has been done. Echo has not been mentioned in the history she gave, and echo is very important because coarctation of aorta can present with hypertension very late. And even if a coarctation is repaired, children can still have hypertension. So Dr. Shweta has asked, what investigations would you recommend in the initial assessment? So all children with hypertension should undergo a urine analysis, renal function and serum electrolytes. Along with this, a lipid profile is done. If the age is more than 6 years, or if the age is less than 6 years, or there is some abnormality in the urine analysis or the renal function, then we need to do an ultrasound. And depending upon the ultrasound findings, we would decide on further investigation. Dr. Ritika has asked the definition of nocturnal hypertension. So there is isolated nocturnal hypertension and nocturnal hypertension. Isolated nocturnal hypertension, basically we can define only on the basis of ABPM, which means the awake time BPs are normal, but the nighttime BPs are more than the thresholds. This is isolated nocturnal hypertension. Along with this, there can be non-dipping also. So what is non-dipping is the nighttime BPs should be minimum of 10% less than the daytime BPs. If the nighttime BPs are not they are not dipping by more than 10%, they are called non-dippers. Or if they are rising in the nighttime, they are called risers. Both these are also having nocturnal hypertension. So nocturnal hypertension can exist alone, like isolated, or it can be there along with diurnal hypertension. So what is the most common type of pediatric hypertension, primary or secondary? As of today, we still consider secondary hypertension is more common than primary hypertension. There are very few studies which have been done in the Western world which tell that the prevalence of primary hypertension is increasing. But in India, I believe because the obesity and overweight is not to the extent of what is there in Western world, since secondary hypertension is the major form of hypertension. What is the medication for primary hypertension? Depending upon, when it's primary hypertension, initially, depending upon the stage, we, if it is unless stage 2, we need not start medication immediately. First, we start with lifestyle modification. And if the BP is persistently high, then we can start either calcium channel blockers, ACE or ARBs. So if the child is having any proteinuria, microalbuminuria, then an ACE and ARB would be a better choice. So role of ARBs, ACE inhibitors and ARBs are the drugs of choice for hypertension in a child with proteinuria, in diabetic children, and in CKD. So in these children, ARBs and ACE inhibitors should be used as the first line treatment unless there are specific contraindication, like there is hyperkalemia and all, you cannot use ACE ARBs. Unless that, this should be the drug of choice. So I hope I have answered the questions. So Liddle syndrome is something that has been asked by Dr. Koteshwar. So Liddle syndrome is a type of monogenic hypertension where there is a mutation in the ENaC channels. So there is sodium and water retention. What is very common in all monogenic hypertension is generally there is salt and water retention. Liddle syndrome is one of them. Dr. Lakshman Kumar has asked why 6 years is cutoff age for hypertension on any basis. So the I think the reason would be that secondary causes can present earlier. That's the reason 6 years is the cutoff age to differentiate between primary and secondary hypertension. But it's not like it's definite that more than 6 years that there is not going to be any secondary hypertension. As I told you, coarctation can present very late also. So it's generally it's most commonly they present earlier. Secondary hypertension presents earlier. If not with hypertension, they present with, like, somebody is having a recurrent UTI and somebody has scars. So we already know their cause. So they present much earlier with some other symptoms which can thereafter cause a hypertension. So it's not a definite criteria, but it's useful for a quick screening, that if you're sitting in an OP clinic, you want to decide whether you need to do extensive evaluation for some child or not, you can use this cutoff.